In this class, we're going to begin our study of Homer's Iliad in English literature. What I plan to do in these lessons, what I'd like to do in these lessons is lead students through the reading and really get into the details of these stories. There are plenty of sources where you could go online or to a bookstore and you can get a dry Cliff Notes type book where it explains the basic points of the story. It explains who the characters are, just some basic information. But I'd like to get into it a little more deeply so that we can talk about Greek religion, we can talk about Greek philosophy, and really enjoy the benefits of Homer's Iliad the way that ancient Greek people would have enjoyed it, since this was like their Bible in ancient Greece. So what we'll do is we'll just go line by line through the text, class by class, and if there are interesting things to talk about, we'll talk about them. And however long it takes, we'll devote 1 hour each class and get us as far as we can, and we'll just let the study lead us as it does as regards classes and how long it takes for us to get through the material. So we're going to be studying Homer's Iliad, and just to quickly review, well actually let's prepare our notes first and get the lesson labeled. This course, the course name is actually English Literature 1. And I'll explain why it's called English Literature in a minute. English Literature 1, and we're studying Homer's Iliad. So we're studying Homer's Iliad, the first book we're studying in English Literature 1. Now, just to provide some quick background information, because I really don't think we need too much, and I intend to have a separate video that provides an introduction to the Iliad and to Homer. Just to provide some quick basic background information to help us get started. Homer was a Greek poet. He was a Greek poet, and he lived and wrote around 750 BC. This was the end of the Greek Dark Age, and his writing is one of the reasons the Greek Dark Age ended. So we have the writings of Homer, and we have two stories written by Homer. Both of them are called epic poems. And each of them contain 24 books. So these are major works. These are some of the greatest, most famous, most influential works in world history. They were originally written in Greek. We have to remember that. And they were originally poems. Let's just keep reminding ourselves of that. This isn't a novel. This isn't Lord of the Rings story that you simply... These were poems. And they were likely performed by Homer or by other poets while they also played music. All right, so these are poems. The entire story was written as a poem. And it was believed in the ancient world that the poets were inspired by the spirits, by the gods. And we should understand that when the Greeks talk about gods and goddesses, what they're talking about are spirits. Okay? It's not very smart to say that these gods and goddesses don't exist or that they just made them all up. They may not be gods. There may be no such thing as goddesses, but there certainly are such things as spirits. And it's likely the spirits that the ancient Greeks and Romans and other ancient peoples were referring to, And because they were superhuman, they referred to them as gods and goddesses and thought they might try to worship and please them to gain some favors. But Homer wrote in Greek. He was a poet, and he was believed to be inspired by a spirit of poetry. A spirit of poetry that was referred to as a muse. A muse was a spirit that was believed to inspire and help poets. And so to the ancient Greeks, to the ancient Greek people, Homer's writings were considered to be divinely inspired. They were not just considered human writings. And they studied Homer's writing as if it was a Bible. And we'll see if we read it in the right way, if we don't read it like lazy students just trying to get through a class, but if we read it as it truly is, a work of poetry that's religious and philosophical, we'll see that it teaches us about every area of life, and it really is like a Bible if we consider natural religion and philosophy. Okay? However, we're not reading the Greek work of Homer. We're not reading the actual Greek work of Homer. This is an English literature class, and we're studying the translation into English by an English poet named Alexander Pope. Alexander, and his last name is Pope. So when we say Pope's translation, don't think it's a translation made by a pope. The man's name is Alexander Pope. Okay? Alexander Pope was an English poet, and what he did that's so valuable is not only did he translate Homer's Iliad into English, but he translated it as an English poem. So it keeps its identity, it keeps its character as a poem, and we can enjoy it as a poem. All right, so we're going to study an English translation of Homer's Iliad, and this is the first of our studies in English literature, which is useful as a high school English program, but also beneficial just for our study of literature in general. All right? This poem is written by Alexander Pope in a meter that's called Iambic Pentameter, and as I read it, I'll make sure to read it in Iambic Pentameter so that you can hear it as it was written to be read by the poet, by Alexander Pope. So what we're going to do is just read through a passage at a time, and then stop, comment, talk about it, learn about the details, and then move on, and we're just going to work through the poem line by line as long as it takes for us to discuss all of the important issues that come up. If you're taking the English literature course, you're going to have to write an assignment. You're going to have to complete an assessment for every book. The Iliad is divided into 24 books, so you're going to have to submit an assignment for every book. The assignment is going to ask you a number of questions, and I'm going to make sure that in our classes I talk about the content that those questions are going to ask you. So if you take notes and use these recorded classes on video, they'll help you to answer the comprehension questions. There's one other important thing for you to get a hold of. On the course page in the study center, there's a document at the top of the English literature course page. I think the name of the document is Analysis and Imitation. And in that document, I give you a summary of all of the rhetorical figures that were used by writers. And one of the questions is going to ask you to keep track of rhetorical figures that you see in Homer's writing, And you're going to have to go over that document, which I'll probably provide a separate class on. You'll have to go over that document to learn about rhetorical figures so that you can look for them in Homer's writing. Okay? So we're going to make sure we identify all the characters. We're going to make sure we understand the events that take place. We're going to talk about what's revealed in the poem about Greek religion. We're going to talk about what's revealed in the poem about Greek philosophy. And like I said, we're simply going to move line by line from beginning to end, and we're going to take as much time as we need to do that. All right? So that's all I'm going to say in terms of introductory material. I'd like for us to get started with the reading. So let's look at Book 1 of Homer's Iliad. The book starts where you see the large A. You see the large A on the left side of the page. That style of font where they put that large letter to mark the beginning of the text is called a drop cap. So we start at that drop cap A in Achilles. Let's read the first section, and I'll provide some explanation for this beginning of the poem. So let's begin. Achilles' wrath to Greece the direful spring of woes unnumbered, heavenly goddess, sing. That wrath which hurled to Pluto's gloomy reign the souls of mighty chiefs untimely slain, whose limbs unburied on the naked shore devouring dogs and hungry vultures tore, since great Achilles and Atrides strove, such was the sovereign doom and such the will of Jove. Declare, O Muse, in what ill-fated hour sprung thee fierce strife, from what offended power? Latona's son a dire contagion spread, and heaped the camp with mountains of the dead. The king of men his reverend priest defied, and for the king's offense the people died. We'll stop there and talk about the content of this opening set of lines. The theme or the topic of the poem is given to us right at the opening of the first line. The theme of the poem is the wrath of Achilles. The theme of the Iliad. I'm going to erase this. And you need to make sure you're taking notes, not just sitting back like this is a television show, because that's not what it is. I'm not a performer who's dancing for the crowd here, okay? What is the theme or the topic of this poem? The theme of the poem is the wrath of Achilles. The anger, the wrath of Achilles. You may not know who Achilles is, but we'll talk about all the characters and learn all the details as we go. What we're talking about in this poem is the Trojan War. So you have to know a little bit about the Trojan War to understand what's going on, who the characters are, and so on. And I'll give you a quick little summary of the Trojan War. Okay, the Trojan War, just for the sake of making things easy, took place around 1200 BC. The Greeks, or a number of different groups of men throughout Greek lands, sailed across the Aegean Sea and attacked the city of Troy. So the Trojan War was a battle of the Greeks and the Trojans. The people of Troy are called Trojans. It was a war between the Greeks versus Troy. Now, when we talk about the Greeks were never a nation. There was never a nation called Greece in the ancient world. Greece was an area of land. And Greece was divided into a number of different powerful cities that were governed by kings. And so you have to make sure you don't think of Greece as a nation. It's just an alliance of cities that gathered together and fought together. And so there are a few important cities. There's the city of Argos. And if you want to learn about these things in detail, you need to study ancient history or classical history. Argos is one of the great cities. Another great city was Sparta. And we'll see these two cities and their kings focused on in this story. The king of Argos was a man named Agamemnon. Agamemnon was the king of Argos. You need to take notes. This isn't a television show. Argos was the king of Agamemnon. Agamemnon was the king of Argos. He was the son of another king named Atreus. Agamemnon at this time was the most powerful of these Greek kings. Agamemnon. In Sparta, Sparta was ruled by another king who was Agamemnon's brother. His name was Menelaus. And Menelaus was married to a woman named Helen. Helen was Menelaus's queen. Helen was the queen of Sparta. And when we talk about a city in ancient Greece, don't think of it as a city today. We have, let's say, Charlotte. And you can go visit Charlotte, and you get to the border of Charlotte, and then there's another city. And then there's another border and another city, another town, and so on. Don't think of ancient Greece like that. When we talk about cities in ancient Greece, you should think about a city like Charlotte, and then all the lands around Charlotte would be ruled by Charlotte. So the king of Charlotte, if this was the ancient world, there would be a king in Charlotte, and he would govern all the lands around Charlotte, all the towns and cities that we know around Charlotte, he would be lord of. Okay? And there might only be 2 or 3 cities in all of North Carolina. You understand that? There might be two or three powerful kings ruling these great territories. So when we say a city, don't think it's like the mayor of a modern city. That's not what these men were. These men were kings. They had armies of their own. All right? Agamemnon was the king of Argos. He was married to a woman named Clytemnestra, which we won't study right now. We'll learn about her later. And she's not important in this story. But Menelaus, the king of Sparta, was married to a woman named Helen. And Helen was considered the most beautiful woman in the world. All right? Helen was the most beautiful woman in the world. And the women of Sparta were known as being the most beautiful women in the world. Troy was not a Greek city. Well, Troy, we could consider Troy a Greek city, but Troy was across the Aegean Sea. So if you think of Greece being over here, and there's a sea here, and then the Black Sea over here. The map is terrible, but just bear with me. Sparta's down here. Argos is over here. Ithaca, the island that Odysseus is from is up over here. This is the Aegean Sea. Aegean just means the Greek, it's just the Greek sea. I spelled it wrong. So to the east of Greece is the Aegean Sea. Across the Aegean Sea, up over here, is Troy. And I'm sorry, this is a terrible drawing, but I just want you to see that Troy is across the Aegean Sea. Okay? So Troy is not in Greece like the other cities are. Troy is across the sea. The king of Troy is Priam. And his son is the prince of Troy, and his name is Paris. Paris is the prince of Troy. Paris is a young man, and he's considered a handsome, beautiful, young, princely man. All right? So Paris is a famous, handsome prince. And he visits Sparta. Paris visits Sparta, and Menelaus, being a good Greek king that he is, welcomes Paris and offers him hospitality. And this idea of hospitality is when you welcome someone into your home. And in the ancient world, there were no motels, no hotels. There was no place for anyone to ever stay. So if you had to travel in the ancient world, you were completely dependent on other people showing you hospitality, letting you stay in their homes. There were no hotels. You couldn't rent a room someplace. You couldn't schedule a trip and just plan all your where you were going to stay and things like that and eat. There were no restaurants and diners and airports and all these things. There was none of that. So if you were going to travel, you would be completely dependent on other people being kind to you when you traveled. You understand that? And so hospitality was considered one of the most important ways of expressing your virtue and generosity and friendliness towards other men, was by showing hospitality to travelers. The problem with hospitality, as you can imagine, is it's dangerous, right? If you open your home to someone, it makes you vulnerable to any evil they might do. They could steal your stuff, they could hurt you. Who knows? Hospitality always has negative consequences. It always makes us vulnerable. We open up our private life to strangers. All right? And so the host, the person who offers hospitality, does so, and he accepts the dangers of hospitality, trusting that the gods protect hosts, because the gods love hospitality. And therefore, when a man offers hospitality and becomes a host and takes on himself all of the expenses and the troubles of being a host, it's believed by the ancient Greeks that the gods and goddesses defend and protect and reward generous hosts. Okay? So hospitality is rewarded by the gods. And the guests who receive hospitality are to understand that they're receiving favors from another man. And they're to be grateful and respectful to their host. And they're also to understand that if they do any evil to their host, the gods will punish them. And this was part of Greek religion. If you go and receive hospitality from someone and do evil to him, it's especially evil, right? If you steal money from someone, that's evil. If you steal money from a host that's showing you hospitality while you're traveling, that's especially evil. Because that guy offered his house to you, gave you access to his food, clothes, furniture, all kinds of stuff may make available to you to help you while you're traveling, and you're so selfish that you would turn around and actually steal something from that host. It was considered especially evil. You understand that? Okay? And so this idea of hospitality was part of their religion. Almost one of the most important parts of their religion. It's where you practice religion. It's where you show yourself generous, where you love your neighbor, where you help other men. And so what happened was Paris traveled and was received in hospitality by Menelaus. Menelaus was being a good neighbor. He welcomed Paris and let him stay. But Menelaus had to leave. And when Menelaus left, Paris seduced his wife and took her back to Troy. So think about it. Adultery is an evil sin. One of the most evil. It's one of the 10 commandments even for Christians. Adultery is a grievous sin. But this situation is even more grievous, because not only did Paris commit adultery, Paris committed adultery with his host's wife, which is an especially evil act of adultery. And when this happened, Paris took Helen away and brought her to Troy. And you can imagine the humiliation that Menelaus experienced. And Paris, this act of his as a guest to commit adultery against a host, was just shocking and terrible. Not just to Menelaus, but to all the Greeks. A crime that the Greek people couldn't even imagine. How someone could be that disrespectful to a host, but even more, that disrespectful to the gods. Like, no fear of punishment from the gods to do something like this. And so Paris took Helen back to Troy. Now, some people, when they hear this story, they say, how is Paris the bad guy? Helen chose to go, right? Helen chose to go. And a lot of times we focus on Helen, just like in the gospel when the woman was caught in adultery and they let the guy go and they all yelled at the woman, right? We tend to focus on Helen like she should have said no, right? And of course, she should have said no. But the problem is she faced a temptation in being seduced by this man Paris that she should have never had to face. So we're not going to judge Helen because she should never have been even approached by Paris. This is all his evil. Okay? He's the evil one. Even in modern law, if a man starts talking to another man's wife and starts flirting with her or talking bad about her husband and tries to lead this woman away from her husband to himself, in some states the husband can sue that man. It's against the law. It's actually against the law. Even today. There's a name for it. I can't think of the name off the top of my head, but it's illegal to lead a woman away from her husband's affections. All right? To try to turn a woman's affections away from her husband. In North Carolina, it's illegal to do that. There was just a famous football player who committed adultery with another man's wife, and in North Carolina, the man sued him for that crime. So we need to focus on Paris, because in this whole situation, he is the source of the evil. And what he did is considered grievous evil that just has no respect for the gods and is deserving of punishment. And so what happens is, when news of this gets out, Menelaos decides that he is going to gather his army and attack Troy and punish Paris, and he believes that the gods will be with him. Okay? He believes he has just cause to declare war on Paris and demand that Helen return to Sparta. But the benefit for Menelaos is he's not going by himself. He's got powerful friends. And so he contacts his brother Agamemnon. News gets out about this, and the other kings of Greece volunteer their armies to join with Menelaos and go and punish Paris and Troy for doing this. So the Trojan War is the union of these Greek kings with their armies fighting for Menelaos against Paris. That's what this war is really about. Okay? We're going to see that Priam is not necessarily a bad man, but he has a bad son. And this war is about Paris's sin, his adultery with Helen. Okay, you got all that in your head? All right. Now, Achilles, getting back to the story here, Achilles was one of the soldiers who joined Agamemnon and Menelaos. So Achilles is not just one of the soldiers with them, he is the greatest soldier. He's the greatest warrior. All right? And so this story of the Iliad is about the wrath of Achilles, the wrath that makes him such a successful and terrifying warrior in battle. That wrath also has negative consequences for the Greeks. And so we're going to study the danger of anger, right, which is one of the 7 sources of sin. We're going to look at the danger of anger. Anger which makes Achilles valuable, which makes Achilles so successful. We're going to see that anger is also dangerous. And that's what this opening passage is about. It says, Achilles' wrath. To Greece, the direful spring of woes unnumbered. And this makes no sense. Achilles fights for Greece. And yet this says Achilles' wrath is the source of unnumbered woes, unnumbered evils for Greece. Achilles' wrath is a source of evil for Greece. It doesn't seem to make sense. He's the greatest warrior on the Greek side. And so we're going to learn how his wrath leads to trouble for the Greeks. Okay? And notice at the end of the second line, it says, Heavenly Goddess, sing. What this opening, is a prayer. All right? Let's get this down in our notes. This is why it's believed that Homer's writing is divinely inspired. He opens his poem with a prayer to a goddess. He says, Heavenly Goddess, sing for me, sing for us the wrath of Achilles. Teach us the wrath of Achilles. Teach us of the wrath of Achilles. Reveal to us the wrath of Achilles. which was the direful spring of unnumbered woes to Greece. So he prays that this spirit would reveal to him this history. He prays that the Spirit would reveal to him this history of what took place during the Trojan War. He's asking the spirits to reveal this history to him. And this is again why this poem and everything he writes is said to be in Greek religion inspired by the gods. Not just human writing. He's not saying, hey everybody, check out this cool story that I made up. Do you understand that? He's not taking credit for this story. He's not saying, I, Homer, write to you this great story. Like Shakespeare, when Shakespeare writes a poem, Shakespeare introduces himself as the creator of the poem. Homer doesn't do that. Homer says, oh no, this poem is not from me. We need to ask the gods to teach us. They're the only ones who know. They were there. Right? They were there. They can tell us what happened. And so Homer prays and says, Heavenly Goddess, sing to us the story of Achilles' wrath, which caused so much evil for the Greeks. He then goes on to describe the wrath. He says, the wrath which hurled to Pluto's gloomy reign. So as we meet new characters, you need to jot down who they are. We're introduced to Achilles so far. You should know when it refers to Greece that it's referring to the Greek armies. And now we meet a heavenly goddess in the second line. And in line 3, we meet Pluto. Pluto in the ancient world was a terrifying god of the underworld. Pluto was the god in charge of all of the spirits of the dead. Basically, the god of hell was Pluto. In Greek, his name was Hades. You may have heard the word Hades, right? Hades and Pluto are two names for the same god or same spirit in ancient Greek religion. The wrath which hurled to Plato's gloomy reign, that means down into the underworld, into the world of the dead. Achilles' wrath cast into Hades, or Pluto's reign, Pluto's realm under the earth. All of the souls of mighty chiefs, the souls of great kings who were untimely slain, who were killed at a time in their life when kings should not die, killed young. Right? One of the things that's characteristic of war is that young men die, right? Young men aren't supposed to die. Old men are supposed to die. But in war, old men bury their sons. That's one of the characteristics of war. It's one of the reasons why it's so evil. Old men and old women bury their sons in times of war rather than young men burying their old mothers and fathers. In modern times, we say that old men start wars that young men die in. And that's another one of the evils of war. The men who are starting the wars are not the men who fight and die in the wars. The wrath of Achilles, which hurled down into Pluto's gloomy kingdom the souls of mighty chiefs untimely slain, killed at an unnatural time of life during their youth, whose limbs unburied on the naked shore devouring dogs and hungry vultures tore. So not only did these great chiefs die at an unnatural time, they also died without honor. They died without any glory. How do kings die? With great burial processions and funerals and great celebrations and all this. Well, these kings who died because of Achilles' wrath, they didn't get burial ceremonies like that. Their bodies lie on the shores, being eaten by wild dogs and hungry vultures. And in the Greek world, burial was very important in their religion. They very clearly understood the body and the soul were two different things. They understood the distinction between the body and the soul. They believed the soul went on to continue living and the body died. And so for a normal death was celebrated by burning the body. So they would build a funeral pyre, like you see in Lord of the Rings, right? You see them build they build a big fire, like a bonfire out of sticks and wood, and then they put the dead body on top of the bonfire, and they light the whole thing up. The body burns, and when the fire shoots up to the sky, what they believed was that the soul was actually made of fire in a certain way. And they believed that the soul went up with the fire, and so you sort of delivered the soul from the body by burning the body and setting the soul free. You see that idea? Okay? And so the body left unburied on the shore, the soul is sort of left without being freed, without being set free from the body. And so the idea was that in the underworld, in Greek religion, they believed that all the souls of the dead, when they departed into the underworld, the souls of the dead went down to a river, and on the river there was a god, sort of an old mythical character, who had a boat, a ferryman. And he would come with the boat, and he would receive all the souls that had been buried, whose bodies had been buried, and he would take them on his boat and then lead them across this river where they would continue on into the afterlife. But if your body wasn't buried, the teaching was that your soul, the ferryman would not accept your soul onto his boat, and your soul just stayed there. And you were sort of tortured in this state of life after death where you couldn't move on into the afterlife. All right? So it's comparable to the way that people popularly think about purgatory, right? That there's sort of souls in purgatory that can't go to heaven because they weren't purified and made perfect during their lives. So there's a comparison. Now, we're not saying that the idea of purgatory is like the Greek idea of being ferried across the river. We're just saying that it's if you're a Catholic and you understand purgatory and heaven, you can understand this idea. But the souls were also judged in the afterlife. They were judged and purified by punishments. And then most Greeks believed that the soul would be sort of purified from all of its memories, like reset like a computer, and then put into a different body and allowed to live again. And that idea is called reincarnation. You might want to jot this word down. Many religions believe in reincarnation. Reincarnation, right? We know what the incarnation is. What's the incarnation? We studied this in Christian theology. What's the incarnation? No, that's the Annunciation. The birth of Christ, where God becomes flesh, right? Wait, you didn't have an answer. The reincarnation, if the incarnation is is the Son of God coming into the flesh, right? The idea of a soul coming into a body. You see that idea? Reincarnation is the idea that the soul comes into a body again. You see that? And so if you ask the question, what happens when we die? An ancient Greek would say, well, your body is destroyed and your soul is separated from your body. Your soul goes to judgment. And your soul, at another point in time, can enter into a new body and live again. Okay? And so then there's all kinds of weird things that develop. Like, do you ever do something and think you've done it before and you kind of have this weird feeling? Like the Greeks might say, that's because you remember that from your past life. It was like your soul remembers being there or something like that, you know? But, so there's this whole theory of the underworld, and we'll talk about that later, but I just want you to see what it means for the wrath of Achilles hurled down into Pluto's gloomy reign the souls of mighty chiefs untimely slain, whose limbs unburied on the naked shore devouring dogs and hungry vultures tore. So you can see why men would fear vultures. They were sort of a symbol of the danger of a dishonorable death, right? And you could threaten people and say, like, one day the vultures will eat your eyes out, you know? And people did say that, like, as a threat, you know, in time of war. And now here we learn what the problem was that developed. Since great Achilles and Atrides strove. So there was a fight, there was a strife between two men, Achilles and Atrides. And who is Atrides? Son of Atreus is what the word Atrides means. Atrides means son of Atreus. So Achilles and Agamemnon got into a conflict. Agamemnon was the leader of the Greek armies. Achilles was the greatest of the Greek soldiers, and they got into a disagreement. And that disagreement caused these evils, and we're going to learn about these evils. But the main event that caused the trouble was a fight, a conflict between Agamemnon and Achilles. Both on the same side, both on the Greek side fighting against Troy. Okay? So this opening passage here, we see Homer praying to the goddess to sing to him, to reveal to him, to inspire him, and reveal to him the story of the events of the Trojan War, where Agamemnon and Achilles got into a fight about something, and the wrath of Achilles brought terrible evils upon the Greek people. He goes on to say, "Declare, O Muse, in what ill-fated hour sprung the fierce strife, from what offended power? Latona's son, a dire contagion spread, and heaped the camp with mountains of the dead." Again, Homer prays. He says, "Declare, O Muse, tell me, O Muse, speak, O Muse. In what ill-fated hour?" And there we have this idea of fate introduced. The idea of fate is another ancient Greek idea, and the idea of fate is that your future is determined before you're born, and there's nothing you can do about it. The gods determine, especially a god that they called fate. Fate determines what you're going to do in life, and there's nothing you can do about it. Fate can give you an evil future, and no matter how good you try to be, you will suffer your evil future. There's nothing you can do about it. And to other men, fate may give a good future, and even though they're evil, even though they're wicked, they have prosperity and all these things because they were fated to have such. And a good man could suffer evil because he was fated to suffer evil. The famous example of fate, evil fate in ancient Greece, was the story of Oedipus Rex. You can read the story of Oedipus Rex. He was fated to kill his father and marry his mother. That was his fate. And he learned about that fate and tried to avoid it, but he couldn't avoid it, and he ended up killing his father and marrying his mother, not knowing that they were his father and mother. And it's an example that no matter what you do, no matter how hard you try, or how good you seek to be, no one can escape his fate. All right, so you might want to read the story of Oedipus Rex. I think it's one of the best stories ever written. Aristotle said it was the best story, like the perfect story. Okay? So the idea of fate. So ill-fated hour means an hour that was fated to be evil. In what ill-fated hour sprung the fierce strife? And then he asks, from what offended power? From what offended power? Because the Greeks believed that every human action, every human experience was directly influenced by the gods and goddesses. Things didn't just happen randomly. How you guys will say, oh, this randomly happened. Greeks didn't believe that anything happens randomly. They believed that the gods and goddesses were directly involved in the affairs of men. And if something weird happened, you know how sometimes you say, oh, this thing happened, it was so weird. They would say there's no such thing as a weird thing happening. The gods and the goddesses are active in your life. We would say the same thing as Christians. We would say nothing happens randomly. Anything that happens in your life is either done by God or is allowed to happen by God. And there are spirits at work in your life. There are angels at work in your life trying to lead you to do good. There are demons involved in your life trying to lead you to do evil. Nothing is random. Nothing is chance. Everything is influenced by supernatural forces that live invisibly around us. Okay? What offended power? Latona's son. Latona was an ancient goddess. Her son was the god Apollo. It says it right in the footnote there. Apollo, a dire contagion spread and heaped the camp with mountains of the dead. So there was a fight, some kind of strife between Agamemnon and Achilles, and as a result of this strife, whatever happened, the result was that the god Apollo sent a plague upon the Greek armies. That's what a dire contagion, you've heard of contagious disease, right? A contagion is a disease. A dire contagion, some terrible disease spread through the Greek army, not because they got a virus but because the god Apollo inflicted them with a plague. Okay? And heaped the camp with mountains of the dead. There were mountains of dead bodies of Greek soldiers in the camp because of this plague. Okay, so you got the picture in your mind? Something happened between Agamemnon and Achilles that provoked Apollo to send a plague that killed massive numbers of Greek soldiers. So you see the danger in war. What this teaches us about Greek religion. This is one of the questions that you're supposed to ask. What this teaches us about Greek religion. We've already seen so far that they believe the gods and goddesses are involved in human affairs. But here's the danger. If you go to war, you know how in the Bible it says, some trust in chariots, some trust in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. That idea was also held by the Greeks. It doesn't matter if you have the largest army. It doesn't matter if you have the best warriors, because when you go to war, it's not just men against men. Who else is involved? The gods. And so your army may be more powerful than the other army. You may have better weapons than the other army. You may have greater leaders than the other army, but the gods can wipe out your army in an hour. And so not only do you need to fight, not only do you need to have a great army and great weapons and great skill and great leaders and all of these human things, you also have to be religiously pure when you go into war, or the gods will take you down. And they believe that in war, in battles, the gods used battles to carry out their judgments. So what determines who lives and who dies? The gods. So if you were a thief and you stole something 3 months ago and you got away with it, the gods can just be waiting for the opportunity to punish you, and they've already determined that when you enter into this war as a soldier, they're going to punish you in war, and you're going to die because of your theft, which you committed. You understand that? So war was a time when the gods actually carried out judgment among men. And so here's an example. Who's going to win the war? The Greeks or the Trojans? Well, the Greeks by far. The Greeks have a way more powerful army. They've got tons of powerful kings and soldiers. They've got Achilles fighting on the Greek side. The Greeks are going to annihilate Troy, but it's not so fast. Not so fast. The gods are going to also have something to say about this war. Apollo is going to have something to say. Zeus, Athena, they're all going to be involved. And the truth is, we don't know who's going to win this war. And the only way, if you're a king, the only way that you can give your army the best chance to win is by making sure that your soldiers are honoring the gods. And so they'd be offering sacrifices, prayers, and doing all these other things to try and please the gods so that the gods fight with them and not against them. A great example of where you can see this in another story, which I recommend, as you get this idea into your head, I recommend you watch Henry V by William Shakespeare. If you watch Henry V, there's a version, a film made by a director and actor named Kenneth Branagh. And Kenneth Branagh presents Henry V. And in Shakespeare's play Henry V, Henry V is the king. And he decides to lead his soldiers in battle to reclaim a region of France that he believes belongs to him by right. And we see as his army moves, he is always concerned that there's no crime among his soldiers, there's no sin among his soldiers. And there's one scene where a man that he grew up with committed a crime, and he hangs the man to make sure that there's no crime among his soldiers. Because when they go into battle, they don't want any crimes to be punished in battle. They're going to punish the crimes themselves and not risk a punishment that affects the military. And so you see the crimes, you see the kings concerned that their armies are pure and pleasing to the gods. Or in the case of King Henry, he was a Catholic, pleasing to God. Even the night before the great battle of Agincourt that is told about in Henry V, Henry's up all night, the night before the battle, praying. And you see this image of a king about to go into battle, up all night praying like Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, because he knows that he's about to face evil in battle. And he actually refers to God as the God of battles. Okay, so this idea of war and fate and the gods and judgment and religion, you can see all of these ideas all mixed in here as they go to war. The Greeks should have easily steamrolled Troy, took Helen and brought her back. But war is not so simple. That's even why when we talk about war in our country, you hear everybody boasting, oh, America's so powerful. We've got so many, look at our Air Force. We've got so many soldiers. We've got great warships and destroyers. We've got, a million soldiers. We've got so much technology. It's all this boasting and boasting and boasting, as if a war is just a fight between people and equipment. And you see that modern Americans, they don't believe this religious teaching that God is also involved. Spirits are also involved in wars. And the most powerful nations don't necessarily win the wars. Okay? So you can see in our generation, you can hear this kind of arrogant, godless talk. You understand that? You can hear this godless, arrogant talk. But Apollo had something to say in this battle here. So, declare, O Muse, in what ill-fated hour sprung the fierce strife, and what offended power Latona's son Apollo a dire contagion spread, and heaped the camp with mountains of the dead. The king of men, that is Agamemnon, so powerful that he was called the king of men, his reverend priest defied. That means that Agamemnon did something to offend the priest of Apollo. And because of the king's sin against this priest, the people died. Apollo struck the people with a plague because of Agamemnon's disrespect shown towards his priests. And we're going to learn about this story, what happened. And now we have something taught to us about politics. So what does this teach us about politics? Where are we at time-wise?
1 hour and 2 minutes.
Okay, we're going to wrap up right here. The last important lesson, what does this teach us about politics? It teaches us that the sins of the king cause the death and punishment of the people. For the king's offense, the people died. And you see the danger of having a sinful king. The sins of a king are punished on his people. The sins of a king are punished upon his people. For the king's offense, the people died. And so in this introduction, to wrap up, we're introduced to the theme, which is this strife that took place between Agamemnon and Achilles, that was related in some way to Achilles' famous wrath as a warrior. Somehow a strife developed between Agamemnon and Achilles. Agamemnon, in the midst of this strife, somehow did something that offended a priest of Apollo. And on behalf of his priest, Apollo responded and inflicted a plague upon Agamemnon's army. And to know this story, to understand this story, and to learn from this story, Homer prays to the Muse and asks her to reveal to him this story so that we can learn from it and avoid these evils ourselves. And so that's where we'll cut off for this first class on Homer's Iliad. You can see it took us a lot of time to get through just a a dozen verses or so. It's not going to be like this all the time, because as we read, I've gone through a lot of background information. We're not going to have to do that again and again and again. After a while, you're going to start to remember the mythology, remember the religion, remember the characters, remember the events, and our reading will get faster and faster as we go. But we have to start slowly to make sure we understand the details. And I hope that that's helpful as we get started reading the Iliad. So what I'd like you to do in your notes, write a brief summary of what we discussed in this class. In your spare time, I'd like you to read the Iliad. Okay? You hear me? I'd like you to read the Iliad. If you want something to do, you want something to read the Iliad. You can read ahead. I'm going to explain the details as we go through. And so you can read it for yourself, kind of get an idea about the next events in the poem. Then we can have class, we can talk about it and explain it in detail, and then you can reread it and really read it and enjoy it because you understand everything you're reading. And we'll just continue like this through all of the Iliad until we're done. And then we'll move on to the Odyssey and all the other works of English literature. So I hope that's helpful.